Now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. Tuesday, March 15th, 2022 marked the 10th anniversary of the South Korea-U.S. free trade deal. A decade in, Seoul and Washington are now widely considered closer trade partners than ever before. Since the agreement took effect in mid-March 2012, the two sides have become key trading partners. Latest data shows trade volume between Seoul and Washington soared over 66%, almost $170 billion last year, from around $100 billion back in 2011. South Korea's trade surplus with the U.S. almost doubled to $22.7 billion in 2021 from $11.6 billion before the FTA. For the U.S., the deal attracted almost 4 times more investment from South Korea, with the accumulated investment over the past 10 years amounting to around $113 billion. For more on this special anniversary, I'm pleased to say we are joined by Shin Sang-hyuk, who is professor at the Graduate School of Pan-Pacific International Studies, Kyunghee University, and Troy Stangarone, who is senior director and fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning, both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, I'd like to start with you, Professor Shin. Get your thoughts on how successful the FTA has been for both countries over the past 10 years, and also what you forecast the next decade might hold for trade ties between Seoul and Washington.
Well, I think the Korea-U.S. FTA has been very successful. As you know very well, the Korea-USA FTA has played a very important role in significantly expanding trade and investments between Korea and the United States. According to the Korea International Trade Association, bilateral trade volume between the two countries increased 67.8% over the last 10 years. In fact, in 2021, the trade volume, the bilateral trade volume was $169.1 billion, and it was in 2011, it was only $100.8 billion. So USA goods accounted for 13.4% of all products imported into Korea in 2021. Actually, it was only 9.3% in 2011. So USA became the second largest trading partner of Korea, and during the same period, over the last 10 years, Korea's proportion of the US trade rose to 3.5% from 2.7% in 2011. So in terms of trade, owing to Korea-US FTA, the trade volume increased dramatically. In the mutual investment also increased dramatically after the Korea FTA took effect. The U.S. actually is Korea's the biggest source of FTI. FTI stands for foreign direct investment. So out of total Korean FTI, inward Korean FTI, USA accounted for 22.3%. And USA is also largest overseas investment destination for Korean companies. Actually, it accounted for 25.2% of Korea's foreign investment. In terms of the investment owing to Korea-US FTA, there has been a huge increase. And then finally, I want to emphasize this point. Actually Korea-US FTA was played a very pivotal role in strengthening cooperation in the supply chain of the two countries. Actually, Korea became a major supply chain partner of the United States based on closer economic cooperation through Korea-US FTA. So considering all of these, I think that the Korea-US FTA has been very successful. And then in the coming 10 years, I think both countries have enough reason to hold for, make every effort to maintain or strengthen the trade ties in the coming 10 years.
Yeah, it seems that way. We've been seeing big Korean companies like Samsung, LG, and SK Hynix build big factories and plants in the United States in recent years, so it seems like the future looks bright. Turning to you, Troy, a question along similar lines, I guess, but between South Korea and the United States, do you think that there's one of the economies that do better out of this FTA than the other?
If we look at the trade data, what we see is that this agreement has been beneficial to both countries. If you look at goods exports, for example, the United States and South Korea have similar levels of growth in their exports. If we look at South Korea specifically, its export growth has been slightly larger on the goods side than the United States. But if we turn to services trade, the United States has benefited more on the services side. So on the whole, I think the agreement has been beneficial both to the United States and South Korea, and that those benefits have been shared fairly broadly to both countries.
Yeah, it seems that way, looking at the figures. Back to you, Professor Shin. As we know, the world is changing at a rapid pace these days. Lots of things going on economically and geopolitically. Do you think to ensure the FTA keeps up, do you think certain improvements, revisions, tweaks need to be made? Some argue that there are these newly emerging issues such as the digital economy, carbon neutrality. Should they be incorporated more into part of an upgraded FTA?
Yes, I think so. Already the USA and the South Korean government have signaled the digital economy as an important area to deepen and widen bilateral cooperations, particularly in the emerging technologies and semiconductors and electric vehicle battery supply chain and 5G networks, as well as the technical standards. So if I give you more details, strategic areas of cooperation between the two countries within these the key industries could be included the enhancing private sector cooperation and the R&D and cultivating R&D and facility investments and improving manufacturing capacity and then securing next generation core technologies and strengthening legislation and institutional support. So I think there are enough reasons, needs for both countries to include the digital economy and carbon neutrality as a part of the updated Korea-U.S. FTA.
Yeah, it seems some changes will have to be made, but as with big agreements like this, things take time, of course. Turning back to you, Troy, as we all know by now, it's all we've been talking about for the past couple of years, but the world economy has been through a hell of a time, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement has played a fairly big role in helping the South Korean economy weather the worst, the most severe aspects of the pandemic-triggered financial chaos that we've seen over the past couple of years?
I think the Core FTA is an important foundation for U.S.-Korea economic relations. And just very briefly on the last question, I just want to add, I think the growth in U.S.-Korea economic relations, specifically what was agreed at the May 10 summit last year, are all important issues to move forward, but that we're not likely to see the course itself upgraded. If you were to take and in the United States make changes to the agreement, that would have to go back through Capitol Hill if it changed U.S. law. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we need to find ways to work within the existing core structure and potential other agreements, whether it's at some point both South Korea and the United States join CPTPP, whether there is a broader digital trade agreement. And so I think we need to keep this in mind. But to move back to your question, I think the key for South Korea during the pandemic has been not so much the Core FTA itself, but actually its own export mix. During the pandemic, we saw a shift to digital working, we saw a shift to remote learning, and all of these things meant that we had an increase in demand for computers, for tablets, for cell phones, for video game systems for people who were staying home during the pandemic. All of this meant that there was a huge demand for semiconductors, which we've seen shortages of around the world now. And South Korea was well positioned to take and provide the semiconductors the world needed for this increased demand. At the same time, you also saw through the pandemic, because South Korea had taken and managed the pandemic well, an increase in demand for goods from South Korea to deal with the pandemic. And coupled with that, you saw with the greater emphasis on climate change, greater demands for electric vehicles or electric vehicle batteries. And all of these things meant that essentially when the pandemic hit, South Korea was actually well prepared and had a good export mix to take and drive its economy forward during the pandemic. And so I think that was what played a major role in helping South Korea through the pandemic.
Yes, certainly South Korea is known around the world as being a very much export-driven economy, and having this deal in place certainly helped in that regard. Professor Shin, turning back to you. So we've been seeing the global rise of China over the past decade. Do you think this adds extra weight to the South Korea FTA in ensuring that South Korea and China can work together to extract as much value and as much economic support for each other's economies to kind of counter this rising tide of Beijing's growing economic influence on the world stage?
Yes, I think so. China has emerging as a very important actor, not only in the region, I mean the Asia-Pacific region, but also in the world. And as you know very well, a few years ago, the trade war between the USA and China started in the middle of the very high tension in the global community, I mean global trade arena. Pandemic, COVID-19 broke out. In the middle of those kind of situations, I think the global supply chain has been disrupted. In this kind of situation, we can see the Chinese rise as a big actor, not only as an economic actor, but also a political actor. So the USA want to counter China's growing influences in the global community as one of the way, certainly strengthening cooperation, economic cooperation with Korea in the name of the Korea-U.S. FTA seems to be very, very important. Because, by strengthening economic cooperations with Korea in the name of the FTA, certainly the USA could increase the influences or the existence in the region as an economic actor, but also these days the economic trade issues cannot be separate from the political and security issues. So considering all of these, certainly by strengthening economic cooperation through the Korea-U.S. FTA, the USA will be able to counter the rising Chinese growing influences in the global community. But one thing which I want to emphasize this point, one thing which I want to emphasize is that, Seoul will need to carefully balance its relationship with the US and China. South Korea does not want full-scale decoupling and will make efforts to retain some access to Chinese market, because Chinese market is very lucrative and very huge. So the government cannot give up the Chinese market. So certainly this is one of the aspects. By strengthening the economic cooperation between Korea and the United States through the Korea-U.S. FTA, they should maximize the economic benefits, which could be very important for both countries. By doing so, certainly, as I said before, the USA could counter China's growing influences, not only in the region, but also in the global community.
And Troy, back to you. Former US President Donald Trump famously labeled the FTA as horrible, his word for the United States, insisting numerous times that it was badly lopsided in Seoul's favor. So a two-pronged question for you, really. Back then, do you think he had some semblance of a point behind his argument? And Trump really has been making strong signals now that he intends to run for president again in 2024. Should he win in a couple of years' time, would you expect him to try and come after the Seoul U.S. free trade deal yet again?
Well, I think the course FTA has been anything but horrible. Even by President Trump's own standard, which is the trade deficit, the course FTA trade deficit, or the trade deficit between South Korea and the United States, had begun to decline in 2016. It continued to do so until the pandemic hit. So I think, if anything, by his own metric, this has not been a horrible agreement. Both the United States we've discussed have export levels beyond what they had before the pandemic, all-time highs. We've seen trade grow. This is something to where the agreement has been a strong driving force for both countries. Now, if we look at politics more broadly in the United States, trade is a very difficult topic in the U.S. right now. If you look at the course FTA ceremony that you referenced earlier in your piece and Catherine Tai's remarks, USTR Catherine Tai's remarks on, autos and agriculture, also at that ceremony, she said that this is essentially, FTAs can have a positive role. And this is one of the first times the Biden administration itself has talked about FTAs in a positive sense as well. And so I think this kind of helps to illustrate the challenges you have faced politically here in the United States for trade at the moment. And this is one reason why, if we look at the Biden administration's own trade policy, the Indo-Pacific cooperation that they're trying to build is still very skeletal in its own nature. And so the politics of trade is difficult in the United States. And I think it's even less clear whether President Trump will even be the Republican nominee come 2024. Right now, he's very out of step with even Republicans on the issue of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So you're starting to see more Republicans push back. In my home state of Tennessee, to be honest, President Trump endorsed a Republican candidate, and state Republican leaders are pushing back strong against that candidate and feeling that he doesn't have the right to anoint people to be their nominees. So I think you're starting to see more pushback against President Trump. And so I think there's a lot of open questions about 2024.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the old Trump supporters have kind of jumped off the Trump train, as they called it, over the past couple of years for various different reasons. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But before we wrap up, just briefly, Professor Shin, I just wanted to ask you, for our international viewers who just might not be that aware, just walk us through what are some of the biggest exports in terms of products and services that flow from South Korea to the United States and vice versa.
Well, the major exporting items, the Korean exporting items were automobiles and components, petroleum products, rechargeable batteries and refrigerators and synthetic resins and things like that. And from the United States, agricultural products and then crude oil and then equipment making for the semiconductors, LPGs and natural gases and the vehicles. And in fact, in the coming 10 years, I think the major exporting items between two countries will be changed a little bit. For example, maybe the diesel and gasoline engine vehicles could be replaced with the electric vehicles. I think there will be some changes, but I think as a whole, there will not be big changes in the trade items between Korea and USA, I think.
Yeah, electric vehicles really are the thing of the moment. Barely a day goes by when I almost don't get run over by those electric cars coming up behind me, making basically no sound at all. Wonderful talking to you both, and hopefully we can speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.